Well, aloha. I can see that the mic is working, and I say aloha from Hawaii. That is the term that we use, much like namaste, to recognize the beauty in the human spirit. And I love making that reference because Hawaii and India do share very much a kind of spirit that I look forward to speaking about this evening. The opportunity to address this audience is an enormously important one for the state of Hawaii. I am on the Supreme Court of the state of Hawaii. Our court in some ways has blended with the Supreme Court of India because we've had so much leadership, which I will speak about on this topic, the topic of global justice and climate change. And as you can see, I've added some words that have to do with giving a new reference, maybe a reference that we need to describe the level of emergency of climate change, which is sui generis. Before I move into my remarks, though, I can't help but recognize two extraordinary people who have created an extraordinary person we've all heard from, and we all, I think everybody here admires. And that's Professor Raj Kumar, who in many ways I think of as an avatar of justice. So his parents, Dr. Chakalingam, that's his father, doctor, and his mother, doctor, are in the audience, and I'm honored to be able to speak before them. Justice Call, it is a great honor and privilege to be addressing you. And Dr. Singhvi, thank you so much for your leadership. And you've led me in many conversations before this podium. And I also want to recognize my brother, Professor Krishnan, as well as Sridhar, who is one of the main personalities at Jindal Global Law School. But I also have in the audience a person who I'll give a greater reference to as we move ahead, who kind of personifies this idea of the power of the India Supreme Court in terms of leadership and example in the world. And that's Justice Swatantra Kumar, who came to Hawaii, created the most powerful environmental court in the United States, gathered judges globally, and is one of the architects of an institution that was created around this concept that I'm going to be speaking about, global justice and climate change in the time of a sui generis emergency. And that's the Global Judicial Institute in the Environment, another institution recently formed in the last 24 months is the Climate Crisis Commission of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. I mention this because the reaction of judges and the legal community is starting to be commensurate with something that is quite extraordinary, literally, like it's never been seen before in the history of civilization. Some of the references I'll be making that are worth mentioning up front have to do with climate emergency and the fact that there's a limited time to deal with this emergency before a collapse of the capital markets, a collapse of the economy, and a collapse of the rule of law. The Paris Agreement underlies all of this, and I'll get into more detail about how it's been so aspirational as opposed to authentic, or ambitious is the term that's used at the COP, which is taking place now. And this idea of watchers, followers, and leaders, it's always helpful to understand we're past the point of watching. We're past the point of necessarily relying on followers. We do need leaders. And in this community, I mean, I'm honored that the senior bar is here. I'm honored that members of parliament are here. We have some of the leaders of India here. So in some ways, I would just like to hire Dr. Singhvi to, represent the state of Hawaii. Unfortunately, he can't practice there, but given his eminence as a lawyer taking on some of the most difficult issues and being able to lead even Jindal Law School gives us hope for the future. What about the final stand? We're in the final stand. Not really, not this audience. I do see some young people here. But if you're under 40, you're part of the final stand. In other words, the 30 or 40 years that our community may have left before there is an existential circumstance, an existential moment that's a bit like when you see parts of mountains fall, when you see parts of icebergs fall. It's a moment that's never been seen before in terms of destabilization, in terms of chaos. And then the tiger. You know, if we're doing okay, we can have tigers. It's my favorite animal in the world, and I bring it up because it's also India. This is where I'm from, the most remote landmass on Earth. This is how India became a brother or sister part of our community, because we're the most remote landmass on Earth. We're on the front line, as you are. We're on the front line. Our major city is being flooded. Oh my goodness. This is the most powerful natural landscape I think we have in Hawaii, and it's iconic. It's the island of Kauai. It's a wilderness area that's protected, magnificent beach, and the whole beach will be washed away. And it was the most important personal experience I ever had when I hiked in there. Not only because as a high school person, I noticed that most everybody didn't have clothes on. That makes you feel like it's a pretty natural moment. But it was just so incredibly overwhelming. The waterfall coming down to that beach, the pure water you could drink, monk seals, the most endangered seal on Earth, right there on the beach, turtles off the beach, magnificent coral. So this is the moment that I see my brother Steve Marks in the audience, and he's used to this, as is Raj. This is the moment when I invite all of you to Hawaii. And it's kind of a running experiment to see how many of you actually take me up on it. Because when we have somebody that's a leader from India, it is a very important step forward for us. So you're welcome to join us, because we still have a robust, wonderful environment that in the collective human consciousness you may think of as, now in the consciousness of people like us that can think globally, that have traveled, this might be the ideal environment on Earth. If you were God, you might put it in this spot in the ocean, because the weather is consistently wonderful. We do not have any predators. It's just a magnificent environment. And these are some of our treasures that always make me feel like I'm in a transcendent place when I see them. But at least 3 of them will be gone in about the time that you're going to have over 100 million people leaving Bangladesh, most of them coming to India in 40 or 50 years. The dolphins, though, they're smart and they're wide-ranging, and they may still be around. Okay, so we're not here to hand-wring and talk about the disaster that's coming as much as we're here to talk about the plight that judges have in coming up with solutions. This is a solution night. And these are some of the ways of describing how we can have hope from a judicial point of view. Strategic judicial enforcement, regional awareness, and resource deployment. What does that mean? Think about what can save the earth. Now, if we have leaders that are the transcendent, powerful leaders that arise once in a while, we had Martin Luther King, you've had Mahatma Gandhi, you've had Ashoka. I mean, leaders like that can arise. But you know, the most important tool we can all agree, particularly since we have so many eminent practitioners of the law, or appreciators of the law, or teachers of the law, is right now, I would submit, the most important force for civilization is the rule of law right now. It is remarkable how people follow it in so many places when there's a decision made by a court, and it can maintain peace, and it can, of course, maintain stability in the international markets and the economy. It is so important. And the declaration of a climate emergency by a court, imagine the level of power that comes with an emergency, such as with the pandemic, when we suspended virtually all civil liberties in Hawaii not too long ago. So this is our beach. that you would visit when you come, and I'll be happy to take you there. It's so comfortable. The water's warm, it's clean, and you can see the magnificent hotels, but it will be gone in about 40 years. It'll be washed away. So let me speak a bit about the present. Like, for example, the COP that's taking place as we speak. Now, there was an iconic speech given by the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, at Columbia University last year. Why is it iconic? Because he had been through the pandemic. He compared the emergency, the global emergency, to climate change. And he said, clearly we were able to get together, take care of this global emergency, and recognize how profoundly significant it was, because all the airplanes stopped in Hawaii, our economy came to a grinding halt for the pandemic. And as a means of comparison, back then, a year ago, he said that the climate emergency is severe compared to the pandemic. And he comes from a context that's worth thinking about, because in 2015, this idea of climate became so important that the president of China and the president of the United States, President Xi Jinping, as well as President Obama, got together in a bilateral agreement before the Conference of the Parties under the United Nations, and said this is an international emergency, and helped add significance to the 1.5 degrees because of the kind of environmental disaster that would be global. And there was a commitment that was, I would call, an ambition commitment. It was an aspirational commitment to take steps. They called it nationally determined contributions. Each nation would take a certain amount of carbon out of the air, and that was their nationally determined contributions that would be determined voluntarily. So you had this collection of leaders from around the world to come up with this great agreement, the foundation of which was laid before the COP by the President of the United States and the President of China. So in 2021, when he was speaking, he was talking about what is happening in terms of the reality. So let's talk about the reality that we're involved in at the moment with respect to the COP and Antonio Guterres' statement about 48 hours ago. So he pointed out that this is now the central issue for the world or for civilization, the global warming, and making sure it doesn't heat up to 1.5 degrees. And he said it is linked to the major threats to humanity, and he named 3 of them. He named starvation and hunger. He named chaos, and he named war. That's a pretty strong statement. And then his point was that we are on a climate highway to hell. We are on a climate highway to hell. So you can see his tone has changed since 2015 or since his speech a year ago. We're on track for 3 degrees. And 3 degrees for the world economy means, well, it's gotten the attention that it deserves from the leaders of our community that some people call the perpetrators, the environmental perpetrators, those that are responsible. It's getting the attention of the markets. It's getting the attention of the energy companies. At a time when, and this brings me to, it's an odd kind of irony, the hope that we have. Are we going to be able to solve this problem without Exxon, without British Petroleum, without the major energy companies of the world? Are we going to be able to get the capital together if we don't include BlackRock, the biggest capital management company in the world, and by far the most prominent capitalist leader in the world, who is Larry Fink, who's in charge of BlackRock? Are we going to be able to do this by suing them, by taking action that, let's say, is confrontive, litigious? Well, we only have maybe 7 or 8 years to make the change that's going to take care of people that are under 40. So what am I implying? Imagine this. Imagine what's happened in the world in terms of the disparity of income that was talked about by Justice Call. Let's do some pareinesia. Let's talk the truth about the reality of what's happening at the moment. So imagine what the profit has been just since the pandemic for the oil companies, $200 billion. Record profits that the world has never seen. Now, this is used by a community that I spend time with, and I've been fortunate to be able to travel around the world with judges, travel around the world with young people. And I don't just mean the young lawyers who I'll speak about, and some of these brave, incredible lawyers are from India and that are part of the final stand. I'm talking about also young people who've rightfully become cynical, rightfully have decided that Barack Obama was correct at the last COP when he gave this talk that involved paranesia, involved moving beyond rhetoric, moving beyond the conversations that take place amongst developed countries that really ignore the suffering and injustice that developing countries or island states like ours are facing. When he said, you know, the governance systems aren't working, Barack Obama said. He said, I'm talking to the future generations now. If you want to survive and you want to have a good fortune, then you need to get involved and vote like your life's depending upon it. Why do I say that? Because what's happening now is that you've got a vast group of people that are going viral. And I know it wasn't something I said. But good night, Justice Call. Aloha. It is, as we speak, if you go on the internet, you will see that there are now millions of young people that are connecting on this issue. And they need hope. They need a solution. And to be able to move into that realm where we're talking about a positive future means we've got to come up with, I guess you could say, a collaborative solution, a climate survival plan. If you were being put in charge of a major corporation and it looked like the corporation was about to collapse, your job would be to come up with some way to restructure the company or a plan. Imagine this. There is a vacuum that is, as Barack Obama has said, a bit of an indictment about our governing systems because there is not yet a climate survival plan that lays out the solutions that are necessary in order to reduce carbon emissions sufficiently to protect the Earth. And as that was the leading atmospheric scientist in the world that said, at the present trajectory, over 140 million people are going to leave Bangladesh in about 40 years. So now the judges are in a condition of paranesia. As we know, judges have to deal with the facts and they have to look at the truth. And if it turns out that there's a violation of the law, then they have to have a remedy. Right now, there are over 100 cases that refer to the Paris Agreement, but the Paris Agreement's too loose, it's too broad. And it certainly isn't providing the kind of transformational change we need. So what's my point? Judges don't have a choice. We wield the rule of law. We have to come up with a solution. Or else, as this eminent justice from New South Wales says, the rule of law, when you think about the movement of hundreds of millions of refugees, when you think about the fact that the major cities such as Honolulu, Rio, Shanghai are going to flood, when you think about the fact that Calcutta has to be evacuated because it'll be so hot, yes, it's true. The destabilization that will take place is something society hasn't seen before. So when the courts have to address it around the world, India is prominent. And this is one way of saying that India is prominent, because in the United States, our federal courts are taking a different direction than India, different direction from China, different direction from Europe. Our federal courts are saying there isn't really a right to a stable climate capable of supporting human life. Now, this is the case that's the most important one in the United States, in which a federal judge found that there was such a right and was overruled by the United States Court of Appeals, but there was a tremendous dissent. And it's worth citing the language in this dissent to give you an idea how the rule of law is now in flux. It is in a state in which we need the leadership of the Supreme Court of India. So she said in the dissent, It is as if an asteroid were barreling toward Earth and the government decided to shut down our only defenses. Seeking to quash this suit, the government bluntly insists that it has the absolute and unreviewable power to destroy the nation. This is what, this would be like the High Court of one of your states, like, or a High Court of Mumbai, for example. That is the dissent in this. So the language is becoming extreme in the United States from usually very, very measured judges. This is a statement from the federal judge in the Juliana case. Federal courts too often have been cautious and overly deferential in the arena of environmental law, and the world has suffered for it. The most recent case you probably heard about from the Supreme Court in the dissent, West Virginia versus EPA, where we had a Supreme Court that went rogue, I guess you could say, and decided that the Environmental Protection Agency wasn't able to put together a climate protection plan involving regulating greenhouse gas emissions, and she said it was frightening. That's the language she used for her colleagues on the United States Supreme Court. I have a great law clerk, and I said, you look at the Dobbs case. The Dobbs case is now absolutely the most famous case that the United States Supreme Court has decided in generations, right? Because it took away a woman's right to an abortion that was there for 50 years. Again, this is language that says from the dissenters, it included these great justices, including Justice Kagan and Justice Sotomayor. It breaches a core rule of law principle, stare decisis. And if you reject that rule of law, stare decisis, you're in a different ground that's pure power, designed to promote constancy in the law. And then she is straightforward in saying this undermines the court's legitimacy. I defy you to find language in the history of the United States Supreme Court that's getting this extreme. Why? This is a sui generis emergency. But, and this is what, maybe I could end right here because I finally get to say this about my own court. The state courts are different. And ours is the first court that found, just like Judge Aiken did in the federal court, although we found it under our Constitution, you do have a right in the state of Hawaii to a stable climate capable of supporting human life. And so there's a departure starting to take place. There's language in the Supreme Court of Washington State. Now, as I say, there's a culture in the United States, to some extent among the judges, even in the states, but this is the Chief Justice of the state of Washington that's basically, and I asked him, he said he didn't even know about the dissent in the Juliana case. And he's talking about, again, how the court is taking away this protection for future generations that's straightforward. What do you think the Court of India, the Supreme Court of India would say if the question was, do citizens have a right to a stable climate capable of supporting human rights? I think, in a way, they've already decided it. Okay, so here we are. On the left, you have David. On the right, you have Goliath. This is the future generation facing the Goliath. You have to be a very organized little gorilla that's facing this overwhelming power, and you've got to have courage. And you can look at Ashoka. Well, Ashoka had a lot of power, so let's not use him as an example. But, you know, this is a small man who wasn't particularly rich, who decided he was going to take on the most powerful country in the world by far. And well, I mean, if I ask people to tell me, have you heard Mahatma Gandhi's statement? I bet in this audience, because I say it to law students, they've heard this. A small body of determined spirits fired by an unquenchable faith in their mission can alter the course of history. Hey, that's what's got to happen. And it's got to happen with the rule of law, and it's got to happen with the power interests that have become so wealthy. We've got to collaborate, because otherwise these things are going to happen. This is what happened when the United States Supreme Court did something virtually unprecedented in the history of the Supreme Court, which was to reach down to the district court, that Juliana case I talked about, The Trump administration went right from the district court past our high court, the Ninth Circuit, to the United States Supreme Court to make a request. We get them all the time at our Supreme Court, where you've got the trial court's parties going to the Supreme Court asking them to intervene. And they did intervene, and they stopped the case. So you had law students appear on the steps of the United States Supreme Court. We have avatars in this world that can make a difference. And I have no question that, they could well be in this audience or in the law schools of India. But this is an avatar, right? Thurgood Marshall's grandfather was a slave. He was one of the people that's bought and sold like property. But he ended up with one of the most powerful remedies that is very, very much alluded to by dissents on this issue, or would be alluded to if we had a court like the Supreme Court of the India and a majority, because he decided that you can't discriminate in education based on race, and then the court ordered desegregation. Just let it be known that the country with 350 million people is supposed to be desegregated. That's an avatar, somebody that believed that you can go from slavery, where your family's been enslaved, to a place of justice. We have so much power right now in the court. In the United States, in the war, we incarcerated every Japanese person. I mean, is that a demonstration of power of the rule of law? These are, for us in the audience, this is an exciting slide. For most people, it would be terrible because it's got so much wording. But those are all cases that are protecting the planet, that are arising every single day throughout the world, that are addressing climate change. But the cases aren't going to do it necessarily. Accountability is important. Bringing the litigation against the perpetrators, if you will, might be important. But what's really important is that the children are going to die in droves. Right now, if you were to calculate the number of children that die because they're burned to death in India, it's going up exponentially. When the heat goes up, the country that experiences the severe suffering more than any other by far with children is India. They're dying, but they have their allies that are coming forward. This brings me to what I would propose as the solution that's naturally evolving. Everybody here has heard of Greta Thunberg. She realized that, as Barack Obama said, the governing systems aren't working, so she is going to make a statement with her generation that something has got to be done, and they have become activists. The person on the right-hand side is Roger Hallam, who created a group that's legal activists that are called Extinction Rebellion. Now that's a recognition of the rule of law. And people are doing things. You've seen the young people that are throwing soup onto paintings in museums that are paid for by the oil industry. Or there are people who are, middle-class mothers that are gluing themselves to the floor of airports. This is one of the ultimate activists who we can all give a moment of silence for. Now, this is something that I'm sure everybody will take home with them that's a rather amazing thing, but we, in many ways, endorse murder. If you consider that 3, now 4 environmental defenders are being murdered every week throughout the world, primarily in places like Latin America. Edwin Choder was one of the more famous ones, who went into the forest, organized the indigenous people in Peru to protect the great mahogany trees that they worship, much like the Bashoy community does here in India and has been doing for centuries. And so he was overtly killed. He was taken out into the forest by members of the industry that was illegally. So I'll conclude with 2 slides. This is one that shows what the judges are doing now. We're applying the rule of law. We're applying solutions. We're requiring climate change programs, climate change solutions to be put together by countries. We're not ignoring the issue. I've spoken about the importance of the India Supreme Court in doing this, the principles that they've established, this is a Supreme Court that came to Hawaii and motivated us before the decision was reached that I mentioned. This is the final stand. You're welcome to take down the web address, but it grew out of Jindal Global Law School, and it has continued to grow. Students that are working hard with the help of their professors to protect India, the young people of India, because this is where things are looking like it could be a solution. When you get young people combined with the private sector, and it's starting to happen, so the wealth is turning into a commitment to coming up with the kind of solutions that I'm talking about in a survival plan, then you can have the tiger for the future. You can have a future that I'd say was an Indian future, where you have the kind of magnificent ecosystem that can protect a tiger. And this reminds me of the tiger. This is Raj in my office at the Supreme Court. He has inspired us in Hawaii. I know he's inspired India too. But I am just kind of an India wannabe. Let me say aloha and namaste. I was so grateful to be among you tonight. It's, I guess, fate shined on us in a beautiful way. I thank everybody that put this gathering together, and I stand before you as a person with great hope, but partly because of the power, integrity, and leadership of the country of India and many of you. So aloha and namaste.